that resolving a problem through external means usually creates problems at the same time. And so, in the final analysis, there's no getting away from the pain. As long as you're running from the pain, you're running from yourself because you are in pain. And as long as you're running away from yourself, you'll never find yourself and you'll never recover. So at some point or another, in the recovery process, you actually have to embrace the pain and own it as your own. And as another Buddhist teacher says in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, he says, so whatever you do, don't shut off your pain, accept your pain, and remain vulnerable. However desperate you become, accept your pain as it is, because it is in fact trying to hand you a precious gift, the chance of discovering through spiritual practice what lies behind sorrow. And don't we know only too well that protection from pain doesn't work, and that when we try to defend ourselves from suffering, we only suffer more, and then we don't learn what we can from experience. Now, we live in a society that tells us that we must not experience pain, and we must always experience pleasure. And therefore, whatever is painful, we tend to deny. So there's a massive denial about child abuse in our society. There's a massive abuse about trauma in our society. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk was a psychiatrist at Boston University, probably the world's foremost expert on trauma, has said that 100% of the inmates of the criminal justice system were traumatized children. And we're in complete denial about that. What we actually do instead is we take people that were traumatized in childhood and we punish them for trying to soothe themselves through medications, through drugs. So we take people that were hurt in the first place and then we hurt them some more. And we think this is the way to deal with addiction. Well, what the science actually tells us is that the biggest trigger for addictive relapse is actually what, do you suppose? It's stress. So, if you have to, in short, what I'm saying is if you had to design a system that would keep people stressed and what would you do? You would design a system that would keep them ostracized and in poverty and outside the law. In other words, you'd create the very system that would keep them addicted. We couldn't have a better system if we tried to design one consciously to keep large numbers of people in addiction. And we do this in the name of fighting drugs. We're in complete and massive denial. And that denial, of course, is universal. So in this book of mine on the toxic culture, if I do write it, there's going to be a chapter called The Denialists, because we have a whole subculture dedicated to denial. We deny what we're doing to the earth, which, by the way, is just another form of addiction, isn't it? I mean, even President Bush says, here, the problem here is that we're addicted to oil. Now, his solution, of course, was to invade more countries to get more oil, and the offshore drilling, and maybe I don't have to convince anybody here that climate change is evolving in our world, but you wouldn't know it from the politicians.
No.
They're in absolute denial. Now, of course, as in any situation, there always somebody who's going to profit off, no matter what you do. So, when we talk about the war on drugs being a failure, well, no, it isn't. It's not a failure if you own a private prison. It's a real boon to your profits. It's not a failure if you're a police personnel wanting more justification for what you do and more power and more weaponry. It's not a failure if you're a politician who wants to get cheap votes by being tough on crime. So it's not a failure at all. It's a great success from the point of view of some people, like any other war. The Iraq War may have been a failure in terms of its stated objectives or its fundamental premises, but it was no failure for all the many companies that profited out in the billions from that particular war. Never mind the hundreds of thousands of people that died. So nothing is ever a failure. Only it seems that way if we take its premises for real. There's another approach, and that other approach is what Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist teacher, outlined, which is one of compassion and understanding. And I'm going to close out by reading to you again. Thomas Merton is a good Jewish boy. I always carry this Catholic monk's teachings in my pocket. And, he's talking about recovery. Now he's talking about it in a spiritual sense, but it's all the same thing, isn't it? And he says that in order to gain possession of ourselves, which is what we're talking about in recovery, he says, in order to gain possession of ourselves, we have to have some confidence, some hope of victory. And in order to keep that hope alive, we must usually have some taste of victory. We must know what victory is and like it better than defeat. Now, one of the myths around addiction again is that people have to hit rock bottom. Now, for 12 years I worked in the downtown east side of Vancouver, with a population that's the most concentrated population of addictive manifestations anywhere in North America. So in a few square block radius, we have more injection users there than anywhere in North America. If living on the downside east side of Vancouver, in poverty, outside the law, with HIV and a festering abscess on your leg, is not hitting rock bottom, then what is? That's not what people need. What they actually need is that taste of victory. And that taste of victory is, I assume, just from the two people from this facility that I've met, is also with whatever else you provide, it's that taste of victory that you also provide. And that taste of victory is when you treat somebody like a human being. So for the first time, maybe in their lives, they're not experiencing themselves as being rejected, judged, excluded, but is actually valued as a human being. Because even to stand up and say, and I understand why people do it, and there's a good purpose behind it. When people stand up and say, my name is so-and-so, I'm an alcoholic, or my name is so-and-so, I'm not an addict, and I'm an addict, there's a truth to it, but it's not true. Because nobody is an addict. Nobody is an alcoholic. That's just their experience. That's just a particular behavior over a period of time in response to particular stresses, and above all, to that nagging emptiness that they experienced when they were not seen or heard as, or actually heard as children. So that taste of victory is when somebody looks at you and they don't see an addict. They see the human being. Now, as I said, children have a need to be seen. Guess what? So do the rest of us. We also have a need to be seen. So when you look at a human being and you don't see an addict, but you see a human being, when you don't see a ravished body, but you see a creative soul, when that's what you see, then that person can look at the mirror that you're holding up for them and they see themselves for the first time. And that's the victory. That's the taste of victory. And now they're going to like that better than defeat. And that may then make all the difference in the world. Now, recovery is a long, hard haul. It's a slow and sometimes frustrating trajectory. But without that sense of possibility, without that taste of victory, it's simply not possible. So the long and short of it is that it's not just sort of empty sentimentalism and bleeding heart liberalism that calls for compassion when it comes to dealing with addicts. It's the only scientific way of dealing with it. It's the only human way of dealing with it. Sometimes people praise my book by saying that I humanize the addicts. The hell I humanize the addicts? They're human to start with. I just hold up a different mirror that people can see. It's not the addict that I humanize, it's the perception of people, of other people about addicts that I humanize. The addict was human to start with. They never lost their humanity. They lost sight of it because nobody else could see it either. So whether we're struggling with our own addictions, and I certainly have, not with substances, but I've had my behavior addictions, or whether we're struggling with substance addictions, or whether we're working with people who do, the key point to remember is really that humanity is the essence of who we are, and as long as we recognize that in ourselves and value it in another, there's every possibility of transformation. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've left plenty of time for questions. questions or comments, so I could certainly keep on speaking, but I'd much rather do so in conversation with some of you here. So, yes.
So, this friend of mine is bipolar,
Yeah,
actually borderline,
yeah.
and she's going through this thing right now of heavy addiction to pills. How do you equate the dual diagnosis into getting them clean?
Okay, first of all, dual diagnosis has become a real focus for addiction treatment in the last few years. Concurrent diagnoses, some other mental health problem that accompanies the addiction. The reality is that from my perspective, I don't care what the rest of the medical profession thinks, but from my perspective, all addictions are some kind of an attempt to medicate something. So on one level, all addictions are self-medications. So for example, all these people are getting stimulants for ADHD. ADHD, how do we treat it? Ritalin and Dextradine, what do? They elevate the level of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is an important incentive and motivation chemical. Well, crystal meth and cocaine and caffeine and nicotine are also stimulants. They also elevate dopamine levels. So a lot of people who are heavy smokers or crystal meth or cocaine users are actually self-medicating ADHD. And people self-medicate depression as well. So your friend, is not that they have a concurrent diagnosis, it's that both the diagnosis, by the way, all these diagnoses, by the way, we get too hung up on diagnoses too. Diagnoses they're not explanations of anything, they're just descriptions. So you diagnose somebody with ADHD, you haven't explained them. All you've done is you've described how they behave, how they function. Same with personality disorder. Now let's look at a borderline personality disorder. They have trouble with relationships, right? They have trouble committing. Now why would somebody have trouble committing? These are coping mechanisms because they were so hurt in their early